Chapter 14, Agent Foster. Special Agent Brett Allen Foster pulled up outside of a two-story white colonial located in an upper-middle-class neighborhood of Fort Worth, Texas. It was 2 a.m., but the flickering blue light in the living room told him someone was awake and watching TV. "Your agent skills of observation are unparalleled," he proudly proclaimed out loud. He flipped the visor down and checked himself out in the small mirror on the back. Pulling a comb out of his black suit breast pocket, he redefined the part on the right-hand side of his sandy-colored hair. Satisfied, he returned it, and then popped a breath mint from a small plastic package stored in the center console. He sat there a minute chewing and allowing the mint to do its job, working on the fact that he hadn't had a chance to brush his teeth in almost 24 hours. Stepping out of the black SUV, he straightened his tie on the way to the front door. He walked the path that led from the sidewalk to the small front porch and rang the doorbell. There was a small wait, and then the porch light flicked on. He knew he was now being looked at through the peephole in the middle of the door. He flashed his best smile. After a slight pause, it opened to reveal a slender brunette in her late 30s wearing a short black silk robe and pulled close around her waist. He could not help but glance at the bare legs descending from the short length, and she cleared her throat in response to his gaze. "Can I help you, stranger?" She tilted her head slightly to one side, and her brown eyes gave him a look that said, "What do you think you're looking at?" "Sorry, ma'am." He produced his FBI credentials from his inside coat pocket in the practice pull and flip that he had done so many times. "We got word that there was a loud party going on here." The brunette put her hands on her hips. "First of all, the FBI doesn't investigate that sort of thing. Second of all," she untied her robes and held them open to show off, "the only party you're going to find is right here." Her eyes twinkled and she grinned at him. "Oh, my," Brett stammered as he planted a stare firmly at her waistline. "Now get your 6-foot self in here and give me a kiss," she ordered. "Gladly, ma'am." Brett stepped through the front door of his home and swept his wife up in a warm embrace. Gluing his lips to hers, he drove her backwards and slammed the door behind him. He always felt his wife Lisa sacrificed so much for him to pursue his dream. So when he came home from long periods of time away from her, he always tried to make it count. She was peeling his suit coat off with both hands when his cell phone rang, bringing the whole thing to a screeching halt. She glared at him. Now, only two sorts of people call that stupid thing: horribly demanding people that want you to catch bad guys, and your nagging wife. And I'm right here. Her hands were back to her hips, and she began to give her best pouty face. Brett sighed and brought out the phone from his coat pocket. The caller ID simply read, "Office." He swept the answer button and placed the phone to his ear. "Foster." "I need you to pack a bag," the familiar voice on the other end told him. "I can't do that, boss. I'm about to engage in the mother of all makeout sessions with my wife. And by makeout, I really mean have sex." He found himself staring at his wife's waistline again. "I'm serious, Brett. We may have caught a really big fish, and I'm assigning you to check it out. The jet is already fueled and waiting at the airport." Brett blinked at the news and tore his attention away from his wife to focus fully on the conversation with his boss. The Dallas field office had 3 Gulfstream jets on standby, but they were only reserved for director-level trips and cases that were really high profile. If he was taking a jet instead of business class, this really was a big deal. "What's going on?" Brett asked. "If it pans out, it could be career-making. Just get to the airport. Details are already in your inbox." "Where am I headed?" "A place called South Fork, Colorado," his boss replied. "You'll arrive at a small municipal airport in Colorado City. We'll have an agent from the Denver field office meet you. He'll be attached to you and take you the rest of the way. And Brett?" "Yes, sir?" "You probably have time for a quickie." The phone went dead. His wife was staring at him with a concerned look on her face. "What's going on?" she asked. "I'm not sure," he replied, "but I'm headed to Denver on one of the jets, so whatever it is must be big. However," he swept his wife back into his arms and gave her a wolfish grin, "the boss just gave me a direct order." "What's that?" she asked. Brett picked his wife up and carried her into the living room to show her. An hour and a half later, and he was taxiing down a runway preparing for takeoff. scanning case. An hour and a half later, and he was taxiing down a runway preparing for takeoff, scanning case files on his laptop. A crime boss by the name of Chuck Kaiser just had one of his sons killed in what looked like a botched attempt to kill someone else. That someone else was Brett Foster's potential big fish. Apparently, this guy had been attacked by Mason Kaiser along with a small army of professional shooters, but the mystery man had somehow turned the tables on all of them. Not just had simply turned the tables, but had killed them with the surgical skill of a high-level hitman, 22 guys in all. Brett whistled out loud. He scanned through the information on the kills. It was still sketchy as it looked like it had all went down earlier this evening and the forensics teams was still combing through all the evidence. From the initial reports, however, there were plenty of headshots made in high stressful situations. That, and the fact that one man had single-handedly took out a large portion of a private mercenary group, not as some ordinary guy as he initially appeared to the responding sheriff's office. The running hunch from his boss, according to the email, was they were trying to kill the man to either tie up loose ends from some other job or they were unhappy with his services and felt they needed to take him out. Either way, if the FBI had gotten their hands on a contract killer of this kind of skill, they could be unlocking a treasure trove of intel on not just the Kaiser crime family, but maybe other high-level criminal organizations as well. It was to be Brett's task to figure that out. His boss was right. This could indeed be career-making. As the plane started to take off, he fired off an email to his secretary. In order to know more about his potential hitman, he was going to need a deep dive on his background. He needed a search for arrest records along with a full exploratory on his financials. He did not expect to hear back from that request until later in the day. Then he closed the laptop and decided. He did not expect to hear back from that request until later in the day. Then he closed the laptop and set it aside. Yawning, he pushed the seat all the way back and tried to catch a nap before arriving in Colorado. He sure did love his job, but it came with sacrifices. Barely seeing your wife and often getting very little sleep were just two of them. He was still sleeping when the aircraft meeting the runway with its landing gear jarred him awake. There was a moment of confusion where he did not even know where he was, but then it all came rushing back to him. He rubbed his eyes and checked his watch. Just after 4:30 a.m. Having your own plane was way better than flying commercial. Doing this the normal way would have taken almost 4 hours with connecting flights, gate check waits, security checkpoints, etc. Not to mention that he would have never been able to arrive directly at a small municipal airport closer to the crime scene. He could get addicted to this kind of travel. He pulled his and simply waiting for him at the private arrivals and departure gate. Hopefully, there would be more background on this potential hitman. He wasn't here to help with digging into the ongoing investigation of the Kaiser family. There were already plenty of agents assigned to that case locally. He was here to see if this guy was a contract killer, and then drain him of any intel on people he might have worked for. This guy, if it all panned out, could put a lot of people behind bars, the Kaisers included. Brett had a feeling he had been chosen for this particular task for two specific reasons. The first, because he had a knack for sifting through seemingly unconnected bits of information and assembling them all into a larger picture of events. The second was because less than a month ago, the director of the FBI had ordered the creation of a new group, the Special Task Force Against Organized Crime. It was to be centered out of the Dallas field office, right in the middle of the country. The group was not fully formed yet, and the office, right in the middle of the country. The group was not fully formed yet, and this first trip was likely a chance to get their feet wet. The task force would both consolidate efforts against the entities that had their fingers in multiple parts of the country, as well as provide localized support where needed. Brett had scanned the 22-page brief on the Kaiser family prior to takeoff. It was run by a man named Charles Kaiser, a.k.a. Big Chuck. Big Chuck was hugely involved in practically every single criminal act in the state of Colorado. Plus, he was spreading outward like a cancer into every state that it bordered. Someone so prolific and expansive in the world of crime, and yet somehow never prosecuted, could only mean one thing, Brett concluded. He had purchased law enforcement members, likely members of the FBI as well. Coming from Dallas meant that Brett was outside of that sphere of influence and less likely to be tainted. Was this yet another reason his boss had sent him out on this, he wondered? Exiting the plane and walking into the building revealed who his contact person was. A young man in the stereotypical FBI two-piece black suit was holding a small stack of files and a cardboard tray with 2 covered styrofoam cups. He didn't know anything about his contact yet, but he liked him already. Coffee was always the perfect arrival gift. "You must be Agent Foster," the young man said. "And I don't care who you are. I just care about what's in that cup." He eagerly dispensed with any pleasantries and let go of his small rolling bag and reached for the coffee. "I have cream and sugar if you want," the young agent stated. Brett held his finger up to silence him. "Stop talking," he said. He popped the top off and slowly breathed in the aroma as he closed his eyes. He drank in a slow slurp and let the hot liquid roll around in his mouth before. "Now then, we can review those files you're holding from the car. Show me the way." "Yes, sir," his contact answered. He did an about-face and began to lead Brett towards the entrance in the car. "Oh, and the name is Ainsley, sir. Agent Brian Ainsley." "I got it." He followed behind, sipping his coffee. Agent Ainsley could not have been more than 27, he guessed. From the way he walked, he concluded former military. He had that crispness to the way he stepped and that lack of head bob that was typically associated with people fresh out of the service. His haircut backed that up even further and zeroed Brett in on the branch. A light brown high and tight adorned his head, and he looked like someone that maintained a rigid exercise routine. Only 2 choices, really: Army or Marines. He could have been a former SEAL, of course, but they tended to have a bit of swagger to them. He loaded his suitcase and backpack containing his laptop into the very back and walked around to the passenger side. Agent Ainsley seemed confused at the notion that Brett was not going to drive. Brett leaned around the windshield and gave him a sideways look and addressed him over the hood. "Is there a problem, Agent?" No, sir. I just thought," he began to stammer. "At ease, Marine. Use your words." Brett smiled at him. "Well, it's just customary for the senior agent to drive, sir," he stated. "Well, in this case, the senior agent would like to drink his coffee while he reviewed those files you're holding." Well, yes, sir." Then he paused. "How did you know I was a former Marine?" "Have you looked in the mirror lately?" Brett chuckled. "Besides, I have serious mad agent skills. Now get in and take me to the diner first, Marine. That's an order." "Yes, sir," Ainsley replied as he piled in and started the engine. Brett laughed out loud and climbed in as well. He flipped on the visor-mounted map light and began digging through the additional case files Ainsley had brought him. In it, he found the complete military service record for their potential hitman. Corpsman. Injured. Honorably discharged after only 4 years. No complaints from leadership. No real combat training. No additional schools. Just your generic run-of-the-mill Navy corpsman. Nothing stood out that might frame Mr. Slaughter as a contract killer. There was the name, however. That would be one serious coincidence that his last name would mimic what had been done to a private hit team for a mob boss. It could be an alias. Perhaps his military record was all fake and fabricated. Only one way to find out. He dug out his phone and speed-dialed his boss, Special Agent in Charge, Timothy Neville. The phone only rang once. "If you tell me you've already have an answer, I'm going to quit and let you have my job," the voice on the other end said. "My agent skills are extraordinary, sir, but not that good. I just landed about 20 minutes ago and I need a favor." "Brett, you do realize that you work for me, right? I mean, you have a secretary that can pick up your dry cleaning." Brett laughed. "Hey, you and I both know the reasons I'm here. You also know that there is really only one person I can trust with certain things." He emphasized the last part, hoping his boss would get that he wasn't alone. "I need someone at the NPRC to find hard copy of this guy's files and make sure what I'm reading is legit." The National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri, contained all the hard copy military and medical service records of every soldier from every branch since World War II. "So this guy was military?" Tim asked him. "Yep, my contact, former Marine Agent Brian Ainsley," He glanced at his driver and waited. Had a copy of his 201 file waiting for me. But if this guy is the big fish you're hoping for, his military background wouldn't seem to fit the standard profile. He's a lifesaver, not a life taker. No real combat experience to speak of. No special schools or training. I just want to make sure this is not some sort of fake background to throw us all off. Okay, Tim said. I'll take care of this myself. I know the administrator personally, so I'll make a phone call when I get into the office. I'm en route now. Anything else? No, sir, Brett said. He hung up and started reading the file on the Kaiser family, not just scanning it like before. It wasn't a complete file, just a summary brief. Big Chuck, as he was known by, had 2 other sons as well, Ward and Hudson. At one time, he had a wife named Clarissa, but she had vanished some years back. No charges were ever brought on her disappearance, and no other family members were listed in the brief. Apparently, the Kaiser family had a variety of legitimate business dealings as a cover for their cash flow. They owned a fast food chain featuring Mexican cuisine. They had several large pot shops throughout Colorado as well, several bars and nightclubs too. All businesses that dealt with a lot of cash. That made perfect sense to Brett. He turned off the map light, then closed the files and set them all aside. Nothing more could be learned from documents. It was going to require physical contact with the pieces of the puzzle in order to assemble the complete picture. Sunlight over the horizon suddenly shot a beam through the vehicle. It bounced off of Agent Ainsley's watch face and momentarily blinded Brett. He jerked his hand up to block the light. Hey, move your watch, Marine. It's blinding me. Oh, sorry, sir. Ainsley unclipped the clasp and dropped the watch into the drink holder in the middle of the seats. And just like that, the first clue fell into place. His gut instinct had kicked in on a seemingly small piece of unconnected information. Brett brought his phone back out and began to surf the internet. His suspicions were confirmed. Agent Brett Foster's task just became much more complicated. Chapter break. When Brett arrived at the first crime scene, the diner, he found that it was not very complex. It was pretty obvious what happened here. Mr. Slaughter had been jumped, and the owner, Mr. Henry Jackson, had tried to intervene. The initial forensics files he had read told him that Henry died from bullets fired by 3 different weapons. One of them was at close range. That was probably done inside the diner. Whoever had shot him had left him for dead. Henry, obviously not dead, went out the back, retrieved his shotgun from the truck parked around the side, and tried to intervene with whatever was going on in the parking lot. Or maybe he just wanted some payback. Mr. Slaughter had been jumped, his weapon removed, and was probably about to die right there. Most likely with Mason Kaiser as the planned executioner. But Henry had spoiled all of that by unloading on them with his 12-gauge. Mr. Slaughter took off, unarmed. The 3 bad guys chase after him, and he leads them back to his place. He didn't drive in the direction of the sheriff's office for help. Instead, he led them to a remote location so he could shoot back. And that's a choice a hitman would make. From the diner, second crime scene just a few miles up the road. It was a wonderfully remote and isolated place, but it was also a great place to be cornered in. True, there was only one direction a contract killer would have to defend himself from, but there was only one way out if he needed to run. That was not a choice a hitman would make. The property contained an incredibly well-planned shooting range at the very back. There was a long-distance range that a sniper could practice on, and an obstacle course for practicing close-quarters style work. All of those targets would cost a pretty penny, several $1,000s in steel targets. Even the biggest gun nut would not normally spend that much. But definitely a choice a hitman would make, though. Now about the dead bodies scattered around everywhere. That certainly seemed like the work of a precision killer. Time of death was hazy on some of them, however. The coroner was certain that the first guy to die was one that had his head caved in with a rock. But after that, it was less certain. The county coroner was on vacation, and they had trouble reaching the assistant in the middle of the night, so the sheriff had taken no other action until the FBI showed up around midnight. The initial response team had used their fingerprint scanner to try and ID bodies that might be in the system. That's when they discovered that one of them was the son of a mob kingpin, and at that point, Everything had went into overdrive. They finally contacted a coroner from 2 counties over, but she did not arrive until around 4 a.m. And because the ambient temperature in the summer is closer to the natural body temperature, a standard liver temp test was not really that accurate. Judging from the rate at which rigor mortis had set in, the coroner still could not make a positive pronouncement. But she said her instinct was that the 7 bodies closest to the entrance died next. It was not something that she would testify to, however. Mr. Slaughter's statement on all of this was that all of those details were hazy. He was being held at a local clinic where they had proclaimed he had a concussion, so it was possible that he, in truth, could not remember. Convenient. Brett met with another agent that was running the crime scene at the house, an Agent Morris. He assured the senior agent that he was only here to investigate Mr. Slaughter and would stay away from any investigating of the Kaiser family. He wasn't here to step on any toes. He said he would like to look at the gun collection that they had found in the house, however. Morris showed him to a well-equipped shop behind the kitchen, and it was, for sure, the layout of a shooter. Lots of workspace, books on reloading, and a gun safe with about 15 weapons stored inside. Unlocked, though. There was also an internet-connected computer. Brett woke it up and discovered that it was unlocked. He quickly checked the browsing history and found a laundry list of gun enthusiast sites. Nothing really odd about that, however. He was sure that it would get shipped back to the Denver office for the geeks to go through, however. He strolled over and started reading through the hand-scrawled notes on various paper targets that were thumbtacked to the walls. Suddenly, a new detail dropped into place. Brett walked back to the gun safe and started looking through the inventory with a small flashlight he carried in a suit coat. He didn't find what he was looking for, however. With his head still hanging inside the open safe, he called out to the agent in charge of the scene. "Hey, Agent Morris, have any of the homeowners' weapons been inventoried yet?" Agent Morris replied, "Sure. You're looking at all we found, though. We were waiting on you so we could tag them all and haul them off as evidence." Brett stood up and addressed him directly. "Well, there's not one .338 Lapua caliber rifle in the mix." Agent Morris shrugged. "Yeah, so?" Over by the kitchen door, Agent Ainsley was looking on with curiosity. Brett continued. "Well, so there are 3 groups for a .338 Lapua." Agent Ainsley spoke up and volunteered. "Well, maybe it was a weapon from a friend." "Maybe," Brett trailed off, looking around the room. He stared at the floor for a second, then began to walk around and stomp on the floorboards in random locations. They all felt solid. He moved past Ainsley and stepped back into the kitchen. He stood there a moment, looking from one end to the other. He moved back into the shop and then stared at the south wall. "There's a hidden gun closet right there," he said, pointing. Agent Morris stared at him with a blank expression, and then, "What?" Brett moved to the bookshelf and began flipping books onto the floor until he found what he was looking for. When he did, he let out an audible, "Aha!" He pulled the lever, released the catch, and swung the bookshelf out of the way to reveal a well-stocked room full of weapons, an extensive collection to be sure. He then turned, looked right at a shocked Agent Ainsley and said with a grin, "One day, when you grow up, you could do amazing stuff like this too." Agent Morris looked on dumbfounded. "Holy," he trailed off. Brett stepped into the hidden room and began to look over the weapons in closer detail. They all had numbers. No serial numbers had been removed. The room was definitely something a hitman would have, but filling it with legal weapons was not something a hitman would do. "Agent Morris," he said, "you're going to want to run these numbers, but I'll bet they're all legal." He then turned to Ainsley, who was still staring open-mouthed at the hidden room. "All right, Marine, take me to see our boy." Chapter break. By the time Brett arrived at the clinic, he had received email briefs from his secretary on Mr. Slaughter's financials and background. He had also been emailed another copy of his 201 file and confirmed that his military past was at least a piece of property in a vast collection of guns at such a fairly young age. Apparently, the man was a wizard at options trading. He had entered the markets with very little fanfare, but at the end of 6 months, he was effectively doubling his money every week. By the end of the first year, he had doubled it at a slower rate due to investment restrictions, but he was still killing it. While the activity report said he was no longer investing at nearly the rate he still had a number of longer-term strategies that were continuing to grow his wealth. In short, this guy was loaded. But why was he not sitting on Wall Street somewhere in a nice corner office? The brief on his background was a story in tragedy. Losing his wife and 2 children on a home invasion was a sad one indeed. However, that someone could be attacked by multiple gunmen on 2 separate occasions was, at the very least, an extreme coincidence. It certainly pointed to Mr. Slaughter being something else other than what he had at first seen. It certainly pointed to Mr. Slaughter being something else other than what he had at first seemed. To the FBI and to Brett, it looked like the man had an opportunity to frequently make criminals angry and become the subject of retribution. Like maybe learning this guy was a contract killer that had taken out a close friend or associate, so vengeance needed to be doled out. He would need an even deeper analysis on his financials, and that would take time. But his past and financial history sure did seem to set off red flags that he was really someone else. The clinic was a fairly small single-story building in an equally fairly small town. Nothing more than 2 double-wide portable buildings connected in the middle by a small lobby area. The sign out front suggested it was an annex to a larger hospital system, and because of his concussion, Mr. Slaughter was being held here instead of a temporary cell at the sheriff's office. How he got that concussion was something Brett would have to ask about, as it was not easily. Brett checked his watch. 10:34 a.m. He was tired and hungry. As soon as he got done here, he would need to take care of both of those issues. He pulled his phone out and instructed Agent Ainsley to wait for him in the lobby, as he needed to make a personal call to his wife real quick. The former Marine quickly complied. As Ainsley headed inside, he instead speed-dialed his secretary. He was going to need a full financial background on someone else as well.